Recall that an ecosystem is both the living organisms and the surrounding environment. It includes non-living components such as chemical resources and abiotic factors like temperature, annual rainfall. Regardless of the size, ecosystem dynamics will involve chemical cycling, as many of these elements are only available in limited amounts and therefore need to be recycled by biogeochemical cycles that help pass it from one organism or phase of the environment to the next, as well as energy flow. Much of an organism's chemical stock is replaced continuously as nutrients are assimilated and waste products released when an organism eats. When the organism dies, the atoms in its complex molecules are returned in simpler compounds to the atmosphere, water, and soil via decomposers. An element's specific route through a cycle depends on the element and the trophic structure of that environment. Let's look at the repeated circulation of chemicals between compounds, states, and materials back to their original state or through organisms. The idea here is chemical cycling keeps the amount of particular elements in balance and available to the ecosystem. The bottom diagram depicts the chlorine catalytic cycle, which involves the cyclic formation of chlorine atoms and chlorine monoxide. The chlorine steals an oxygen from ozone, releasing oxygen, breathable oxygen, into the air. And that chlorine monoxide will then pass on the monoxide, the single oxygen, to an oxygen atom to further make more oxygen and return to its resting chlorine atom state. And so we can see, start to finish, the number of chlorine atoms stays constant in the environment, so too does the number of breathable oxygen, and a given element is just passed from one chemical reaction to the next. All of this is meant to maintain a steady state or equilibrium. Homeostasis is a tendency towards balance. Now, systems cannot stay in balance indefinitely. At some point, events will occur, changes will take place, and organisms will be challenged to weather that change in some way, shape, or form. I want to introduce the concept of resistance and resilience. Species are identified as resistant species if they're able to maintain their present course despite that disturbance. A species would be identified as resilient if they were affected by the disturbance, but capable of bouncing back after the disturbance has occurred. And so the diagram that we have below here compares and contrasts resistance versus resilience. And it's looking at an ecosystem sensitivity to extreme droughts. And we can see that in the first box, the blue box, the grass's ability to resist periods of drought is very few and far between. They die pretty early on, whereas trees have higher resistance because they've been able to maintain growth for a much longer period of time under wet conditions that they can tolerate a drought for longer. However, when we look at the species resilience, the grasses, even though they're affected more severely initially by the drought, they're able to bounce back and replenish shortly following the drought period. Whereas the trees, even if the period of dry has passed, they do not bounce back as much. And this is because it takes so much more energy and time to rebuild that biomass. The water cycle is particularly important because water defines production, the plant life, the producers, and all of the decomposers, bacteria and fungi, are intimately dependent upon water availability. The process of the water cycle involves evaporation by solar energy, condensation into clouds, and then precipitation, the raining down into the liquid form back onto the earth. While the nature of a cycle is to pass through these phases and maintain the same amount of that resource, it's important to point out that the reservoirs of water leave very little available in the way of fresh water. Water is predominantly stored in the ocean, which is salt and not a viable drinking option for plant life, animals, or humans. The carbon cycle is important because carbon is the chief building block of organic life on our planet. It is essential for all life. Carbon occurs most frequently in the form of glucose and carbon dioxide, and the overall recycling of carbon has to do with two principal pathways: photosynthesis, converting carbon dioxide into sugar, and then cell respiration, breaking that sugar down and releasing it back as carbon dioxide. Along the way, carbon will be preserved in fossil fuels, the atmosphere, rocks, trees, human life. The phosphorus cycle is important, not just because phosphorus is important for plant roots, but because the phosphorus atom is an essential building block for nucleic acids that build up DNA, the plasma membrane, which is a phospholipid bilayer, as well as our energy molecule, adenosine triphosphate. Phosphorus is predominantly stored on our planet in soil and marine rock. And so the cycle of releasing phosphorus involves weathering and decomposition. The sulfur cycle is important because sulfur is an essential element for growth. It's a requirement for building proteins, but it also has a negative impact on our planet because sulfur is responsible for acid rain. This cycle involves mineralization and decomposition. So mineralization is the process of high pressure forcing small dissolved elements to solidify underwater into sediment, and then that sediment can be broken down further and re-release. It's important to point out here that sulfur dioxide is not a negative, but when the sulfur dioxide is released into the atmosphere, it can combine with oxygen already present in the atmosphere and then rain down as sulfuric acid. That's SO4. And that's where we have the downside. So the saying, what goes up must come down, is true, as is the nature of gravity, but it doesn't always have to return in the same format. Last but not least is the nitrogen cycle. Nitrogen is important as it's a building block for nucleic acids, amino acids, and proteins. Nitrogen is predominantly in the atmosphere. It constitutes 80% of our breathable air, and we cannot obtain nitrogen from just breathing, so we require nitrogen fixation by bacteria. So the bacteria are able to absorb nitrogen, and through processes of the bacteria digesting it and breaking it down, small nitrogen can be absorbed by trees and then be available in their leaves and fruit and seeds, and then passed on into the higher organisms and animals that way. And this leads us to the concept of energy flow. What we're describing is a trophic structure. These are the dynamic and mapped out feeding relationships that exist within an ecosystem. In general, the energy is going to flow from producers to consumers, and all life can trace their primary energy source back to the sun. So in our diagram here, we can see that the sun is fueling the plant life, and that those plants can be eaten by primary consumers, who then can be eaten by secondary consumers. And when all these things die, they are decomposed, re-releasing their elements and nutrients that they've acquired along the way. As we've mentioned before, the primary producers chiefly determine the amount and breadth of other life within an ecosystem. So we begin by identifying the parts of a food chain or web. Recognize the bottom of this food pyramid is going to constitute the producers. These are the autotrophs. Generally, they're photosynthetic plants, but they're not limited to this. There's also photosynthetic bacteria, like cyanobacteria. These organisms are eaten by the primary consumer, the first consumer in the lineup, and these are herbivores, animals that consist entirely from the plant life. Next up, we've got our secondary consumer. These are small carnivores or omnivores. And then we've got a tertiary consumer, which will be a larger carnivore. Sometimes we can go one step above this to an apex consumer, or the quaternary, fifth level in the food pyramid. This is an organism that has no predator whatsoever. It is the top of the food chain. Beyond this, however, you will not find another organism, because as is the nature of a pyramid, you need more producers than consumers to stabilize the structure, to perpetuate this structure. And what we find is along the way, at each step, there's less available energy to be passed on to the step above it. And so by the time you get to your quaternary consumer, there's not enough energy left to pass to an organism beyond this point. And so while food webs can get very messy and complex, we see the same general theme: more producers than consumers, more prey than predators, and it does not go beyond a fifth step. Climate defines the boundaries of the different biomes. Climate is long-term, long-standing weather conditions of an area based upon years of data and research. The biomes are defined predominantly by temperature and rainfall. To a lesser extent, we see elevation and salt concentration, so saline versus freshwater environments, but the most important parameters are temperature and rainfall. And it's important to note here that the extremes are more significant than the year-long average. These climate patterns, in addition to climate, there are global patterns that shape biomes. For one, the tilt of the planet affects seasonality based upon the direction of sunlight hitting the planet. The axis of our planet results in differences in day length time, which has downstream impacts on temperature. The longer the day, the more likely that environment is to warm throughout that time frame. The uneven solar radiation gets air moving, and the warm air flows towards the poles and the equators. As you can see in the diagram here, the sun is hitting a very concentrated beam directly onto the equator. That same concentration of sunlight is being cast over a much broader surface area at the poles due to the angle of our planet and the spherical shape. Not only does solar radiation move air, but it also results in changes in water current. The global wind systems drive ocean currents, and thereupon the differences in temperature perpetuate churn. As the water cools, it sinks to the bottom, displacing new water, which goes to the top and has time to warm again. And this results in the constant flow of resources, oxygen, nutrients around our globe. Within the various biomes, we also see the impact of topography. Chief among them are bodies of water and mountains. Bodies of water contribute to local variations in climate because water is a thermoregulator. Water heats more slowly than land and cools more slowly than land. And so essentially, water acts as a moderator. Locations that are closer to water will be cooler in the summer and warmer than the winter than their counterparts further away. Mountains vary in elevation, and therefore they tend to be colder the higher they get, and this can lead to stratification of a single environment, but this also results in disrupting rainfall patterns. Due to that temperature drop, the water condenses more rapidly, leading to the windward side receiving more rainfall, and this ultimately creates a rain shadow. A downstream side effect where the leeward side of the mountain range does not get as much rainfall. And the larger the mountain, the greater this rain shadow effect is. These patterns can exist all over the globe. And so we see the same biomes appearing in the North Americas, South Americas, Africa, and Asia. And more importantly, we see that within the same biome, despite being in very different regions around the world, we see the same types of life emerging. Very similar results because environment drives evolution. We call these parallel universes. So an example here is in the tropical rainforests of Africa and Asia. These monkeys are very different species. They are not biologically compatible, but we can see that they have the same general pattern of form, and they also serve the same general pattern of functionality in their ecosystem. Similar niches appear within the same biomes. The alternative to parallel universes are endemic species. These are unique exceptions that are only found in a very particular region and nowhere else naturally. So on the left, we've got an example of parallel universes: the armadillo of the North Americas, the anteater of South America, the African pangolin versus the oceanic spiny anteater. Very similar structures in very similar environments, specific biomes in these regions. The most common example of an endemic species is the lemurs of Madagascar, the only known location where that type of organism occurs. So let's take a look at the different biomes and what makes them distinct and unique. The first biome I want to point out is the aquatic biome. This is the largest biome on the planet. And due to water's effect as a thermoregulator, the aquatic biomes are the most stable environments, remaining relatively unchanged despite the long history of our planet and the many ups and downs or extinction events. In fact, 8 of the 10 oldest organisms are aquatic. The aquatic biome is the largest biome on the planet, but it's not just one space. It's stratified or divided into zones or layers, typically based upon the amount of light that penetrates, whether photosynthesis can or cannot occur there, its proximity to land, whether it's loose sediment provides nutrients, or the extreme nature of that environment. And so we use terms like photic or aphotic to describe whether or not there's enough light available for photosynthesis. Benthic to describe an environment, a microenvironment or a microsystem that contains sediment, or the abyssal zone, which is a scenario which has the coldest temperatures, the harshest and heaviest pressures attributed to it, but may not be near a continental shelf or the ocean floor. Be able to discern these major delineations of the aquatic biome. So in order to thrive here, animals had to get very efficient at surviving cold temperatures, high pressure environments, or utilize an alternative pathway other than photosynthesis to exist in the aphotic or abyssal zone. Plants, on the other hand, had to adapt to either being wholly submerged, occasionally submerged, or not embedded in soil at all. And so I wanted to introduce 2 terms here, littoral and limnetic. Know the difference between the two. Littoral plants, or the littoral zone of an ecosystem, refers to areas where there are shallow pools or frequent flood zones where plants are rooted and may become wholly or partially submerged from time to time. Limnetic zones are deep pools where plants have root systems, but they're never anchored in soil. They float entirely. Within the terrestrial biomes, we begin with the tropical forests. This biome features the greatest number of species, which means it will also feature the most competition for resources. The temperature is consistent year-round, warm to hottish, and rainfall is abundant, sometimes up to 400 inches a year. There are tropical rainforests and tropical dry forests. In both of these situations, that rainfall is vast and abundant, but in a rainforest, the rain occurs consistently throughout all 365 days. Whereas in a dry forest, the rain is seasonal and they will have a designated rainy season with monsoons and torrential downpours at that time. Animals that live here largely evolved the ability to climb. Competition for sunlight was intense, and so competition for useful habitats or niches to hide out in was also intense. Animals had to be able to go where the plants were, and so they needed a way to fly or climb to get higher up to minimize competition on the ground, or to avoid being eaten as part of that competition for resources. As far as animals go, they tended to be much smaller and more compact in size so they could weave through the dense underbrush, or they had to be really strong in nature, able to bulldoze their way past the dense thickets. In the desert biome, rainfall is minimal and the temperature is constant, but there are hot deserts and cold deserts. In a desert environment, water-efficient adaptations like the ability to store water for prolonged periods of time or prevent desiccation, like a turtle, and having a slower metabolism are common, but so too are nocturnal animals. They hide out during the day when the temperature is the most intense and tend to come out and forage at night when temperatures drop. In the chaparral, we see cool, rainy winters and hot, dry summers. This is distinct from in the chaparral, animals here have evolved fire resistance adaptations. Either they're very fast and able to outrun a brush fire, or they burrow and hide out under the fire, or they're amphibious, which allows them to take shelter during a fire or hide out under the fire. The grasslands, which are cool, dry winters and wet, hot summers. Here in these pictures, we can see on the left the African Serengeti grasslands versus the right, the temperate grasslands. The temperate grasslands have typically less rainfall, but more consistent and warmer temperatures than the savanna. But in both cases, we see cold, dry winters, wet, hot summers. In the temperate and savanna grasslands, You find large grazers or small burrowers. The idea here is they have to be able to move long distances to find the requisite water and food, or they're small and able to survive on a meager diet. The coniferous forest is also known as the taiga or the boreal forest, and this is the largest terrestrial biome. Its big distinction is cold and prolonged winters. In the coniferous forests, animals here exhibit cold resistance, and this can arise in a variety of forms. They may migrate, they may hibernate through the worst of it, or they feature thick furs so that they can survive the harsher and longer winter. The temperate forest, on the other hand, is also known as the deciduous forest or a broadleaf forest. Its key feature is that it exhibits 4 distinct seasons. Up until now, most of the other biomes have 2 seasons at best, a dry season and a wet season, but the temperate forest has a very distinct spring and fall in between these moments. In the temperate forests, we see seasonal behaviors and adaptations. Animals here will get a thicker coat, but it's a winter coat, and they exhibit shedding, so it's not all year round. They have to be generalist species that can keep themselves warm when temperatures drop in the winter, but keep themselves cool in the summer when things get hot. Many animals here exhibit some sort of food storage behavior. Either they stockpile and eat a lot prior to hibernating, or they hide food so that they can survive a winter where resources are less abundant. The tundra biome exhibits permafrost, and what this means is there's a permanently frozen layer of soil all year long. It's colder than a desert but receives more rainfall. And the key thing here is that top layer of soil is frozen solid. Last but not least, we have the poles, which feature bitterly cold temperatures, and the day length can vary, resulting in months of daylight or months of straight darkness at the seasonal equinoxes. Animals here need extreme cold resistance. They often will have double coats. They'll exhibit blubber or have fatty oil layers to help insulate them, and traditionally they are white to help camouflage with the snowfall, which may or may not leave throughout the year. There are also tusks or enlarged teeth able to help them break through the ice during the most frigid winter seasons. Within the terrestrial biome, I wanted to introduce the term ecotone. It's an area of intergradation, and what this means is there's no sharp boundaries. There's no clear lines that say this is where the temperate broad forest ends and this is where tropical forest begins. Usually there's an area of overlap where side by side you could step between multiple biomes at any given moment. While the biomes range across the globe and in description, in lushness and beauty, there are some critical factors that are consistent across the planet. These are environmental factors. Some are living, but the majority are non-living features, and they tend to vary in space and time, fluctuating at any given point within the year. And those fluctuations can lead to stressful conditions and potentially death unless an animal or plant, any organism, has evolved behaviors or mechanisms to reset or thrive in that fluctuation. The first one's temperature. Despite our planet ranging in temperatures from vastly cold to extremely hot, most life exists between 0 and 45 degrees Celsius. And the reason for that is cells will typically freeze and rupture, breaking and dying below 0 degrees, and most proteins will denature above 45 degrees Celsius. So if we look at our globe, the vast majority of living organisms occur right around the equator, but there's very few organisms specially adapted to the desert equator area, and very few specially adapted to the extreme poles. Water is essential for life. It is a universal solvent that allows things to dissolve and move throughout the body. It is thermoregulatory, allowing the internal temperature to not fluctuate as the outside temperature changes throughout the day. It also works as an insulator and cushion or protector to the body, cushioning blows and movement. So therefore, the threshold is a minimum of 50% of water is required for a cell to survive. Salt is also a requirement. For humans, 1 teaspoon of salt is necessary every day to maintain the threshold of 0.9% salinity. The reason why salt is so integral is that it drives osmosis. The last factor I wanted to address was sunlight. The threshold will vary by organism, but sunlight has a critical role in moderating our immune defenses, but also acting as a common stimulus for behaviors.